Chapter 16. The whole family, including Brother Whitley, were waiting for me when I got back, wanting to know about Nathan. I told them he was writing songs for another artist's album, that he felt he owed this to Egan, and that he'd eaten some of the lunch and kept the rest. "Tim, he's not being kept there against his will, is he?" Brother Whitley asked. "He can walk out any time he wants?" I thought of Nathan's last words about it being his choice. He sure can. He's choosing to stay and do that. Nobody's making him. Not even Egan, I firmly believed. If Nate changed his mind about Egan and left, I believed wholeheartedly that Egan wouldn't be able to stop him. The tragedy was that Nathan wouldn't change his mind. Egan was his road to salvation, and that was all there was to it. But Brother Whitley got on the phone to his lawyer anyway, and came back out of his study shaking his head. "Earl says there's not a thing we can do," he told his wife. "Nathan's of age, and unless there's evidence of abuse or restraint or the guy's giving him drugs, he can stay there as long as he wants." He told me just to use my own judgment about going to see him. "Take the car any time you want. He probably trusts you more than he does any of us." But I put off going to see Nathan, even though I had told him I'd be back. If I tried too hard to make contact with him, I told myself, Egan would get angry and take it out on him somehow. And I didn't want to upset any delicate balance of sanity versus Egan that Nathan might have managed to achieve over at River House. So another week went by, hot and quiet and tense, as July turned into August. Things were grimmer than ever around the parsonage. Brother Whitley stern, Mrs. Whitley pining for her son, and artists in her room or off with friends. I didn't even go to church Sunday. I was pissed off at God, frankly, for not setting things right, but mainly I just didn't want to go without Nathan. Church was one more place where he wasn't, one more reminder of where he was. Finally, on Thursday, I decided a week of staying away was enough. That afternoon, I drove out to River House. Egan's Triumph was there, but the front door was locked, and when I pounded on it, no one came. I went around to the back. Same thing. I checked the upstairs windows, but saw no one looking out. The whole place felt dead, deserted. "Well, you idiot," I told myself, walking back to the station wagon. "Come back at night when the bar's open. Egan can't very well lock you out then, and you can brazen your way upstairs to find Nate." I got to the station wagon with my hand on the door handle before I saw Nathan sitting in the passenger seat. He just sat, his hands in his lap and his head bent, his hair falling forward to hide his face. "Nate?" I said through the open window. He lifted his head slowly and turned his face toward me, and I have never seen anything so horrible in my life. Because it was an old man's face, not a dead face, but an alive and ancient face, mean and sour, with a million lines and wrinkles and hooded eyes baleful from 100 years of hate. As I stood frozen, trying to draw breath, one shriveled hand came up like a claw. The mouth opened to show twisted, rotten teeth, and he hissed at me like an animal. I ran then, 20 feet away over the sun-baked gravel toward the road. I stood trembling and breathing hard for maybe 2 full minutes, trying to see past the sun's glare on the car windows, trying to see if a figure was still sitting inside. I couldn't tell, and I realized I was muttering, "Please, God, make it go away," over and over. At last, in the stillness and sunlight, I walked slowly back over to the car and looked in, and nothing was there. I scanned the upstairs windows again, but saw no faces peering down. "Egan, you unholy shit," I whispered out of a dry throat. My Catholic right hand came up, and I crossed myself. Then I had to get back in the car, simply because I had to get it and myself back home. All the way there, still shaking and resolutely keeping my eyes straight ahead, I sang Amazing Grace to the tune of House of the Rising Sun. My voice trembled and cracked, but I forced it out. And that kept the devils away from me, I suppose, because nothing materialized in the seat beside me, and by the time I pulled into the parsonage driveway, I knew I was safe, far enough away from Egan so he couldn't spring anything else like that on me. Upstairs in Nathan's room, I sat and trembled some more. I knew what Egan had been showing me, partly as a warning, partly from pure arrogance. He wasn't out to kill Nathan, to end his life. The eyes in that ancient Nathan face had proved that to me. They'd been alive, glittering with hate, and that was what Egan wanted. He'd destroy Nathan's music, break that artistic spirit, and throw him back into the world, where for the next 70 years Nathan would take out his bitterness and loss on whomever he encountered, crushing other artistic spirits so that they'd eventually go out and do the same thing. Hadn't I said something like that to Paige once? Yes, that time in the park, but I'd only been talking off the top of my head. Now Egan had shown me I was right. That was exactly what he had in mind. Please, God, I thought, don't let him. Don't let him turn Nathan into that. Oh, God, please. In desperation, I did something I'd thought about earlier but had rejected as silly. On Nathan's dresser, I'd noticed a small silver cross and chain lying in a heap. I'd never seen him wear it. Now I went over to get it and fastened it around my neck. I'd resisted it earlier because I didn't believe crosses could protect you like some sort of magic amulet. Now I saw it as a way of declaring whose side I was on. The fact that it was strictly a Christian symbol wasn't the point. If Nathan's family had been Jewish and there'd been a prayer shawl lying around, I'd have put that on just as willingly. Because I knew I had to go back to River House tonight. Why, I wasn't sure, but I was going to need all the help I could get. And with that cross around my neck and my mantra in my head, I felt armed. That evening it thundered all through supper with big inky clouds blotting out the late sun, and as I left the house it started to pour. We had watched the clouds with anticipation while we ate, as if the storm would somehow change things. "Tropical depression from the Gulf," Brother Whitley told us. "Maybe it'll break the heat for a while." When I told him I was going to River House, he looked at me tiredly and said, "Thank you, son. You're a loyal friend. Good luck." The wipers on the station wagon could barely keep the windshield clear. I pulled into the gravel in front of River House. Only one beat-up pickup was there. The neon beer signs in the windows seemed to blur and drip through the rain on the windshield. I made a run for it, but I was soaked when I got to the porch. I went in, and sure enough, the only other person was a grungy-looking guy having a beer at the bar. Van actually nodded at me as if he remembered me. I didn't quite have the balls to stroll on back into the hall and up the stairs. So I sat on one of the bar stools at the side of the bar, facing the hall doorway. "Bud, please, Van," I said, and he slid one to me and pushed my change across the counter. The other guy nodded at me, and we all listened to the storm for a while. The lights flickered a few times, but didn't go. I knew how much Nathan hated rain like this, and wondered if he were up in the studio trying to concentrate and work through it all. If he wasn't, I couldn't imagine where else he'd be. I finished my beer and ordered another, stalling, I knew. But as unpleasant as it was in this dreary bar, I figured it would be worse upstairs. I wondered if Van would try to stop me from going up there. I didn't think he'd actually run after me, but I still didn't want a deal. Then I remembered the cross which I'd worn inside my T-shirt. I freed it now from between the damp fabric and my equally damp skin and flipped it to the outside. As if that had been some sort of challenge, Egan walked in from the back hall. His eyes went to the cross right away, and he sneered at it. I lifted my chin and looked back at him. "Well, hello, Tim," he said, smoothly courteous. "What brings you out on a night like tonight?" "And came to visit my buddy Nate," I said lightly. "He upstairs?" "Working, yeah." "Well, I bet he's ready for a 15-minute break." I slid off the bar stool, taking my beer with me and steeling myself for opposition. But Egan just grinned. "You go right ahead," he said, slapping me on the back and following me chummily into the hall. At the foot of the stairs his tone changed, although his grin stayed. "Yeah, you just go right on up and talk to him," he told me. "Talk all you want. You won't get him to go back. He belongs to me." "What do you mean, he belongs to you?" "He signed a contract." I just stared at him, thinking of all the stories about people selling their souls to the devil, signing on the dotted line. Surely it didn't really work that way. He's contracted to produce an album's worth of material for me, for another artist I'm working with, by the end of August, and you'd better believe he's staying here until those are finished." "What does he get in return?" I asked, feeling slightly relieved in spite of myself. "Oh, he's signed up on a percentage basis. He'll see plenty if he can deliver." "Nathan always does what he says he's going to do," I told him, and started up the stairs with his laugh following me. In the studio, Nathan sat on the leather couch with his guitar and a legal pad. His head was bent as he strummed the same lick over and over, and he hardly glanced up when I came around and sat at the other end of the couch. I stayed quiet and watched him for a minute. He didn't look old and mean like the apparition I'd seen today, but he didn't look much healthier. I could tell he still wasn't eating or sleeping. He looked gaunt now, and the blackness around his eyes made them almost invisible. He needed a shave, and his hair obviously hadn't been washed in days. I watched his hands on the guitar, and they hesitated, almost fumbled, as he worked over that same phrase. At last he stopped, ran his hand back through his hair, and looked up at me. Now I could see his eyes gleaming feverishly. "Hey," he said. "Hey, how's it going?" He shrugged, and his glance wandered. I realized then that he wasn't only exhausted, he was afraid. "Egan says you're under contract to him now." He nodded. His mouth pursed slightly and stayed that way, as if something were hurting him. "Why'd you do that, Nate?" "I had to promise him something," he said. "I owe him big. I have to make a real commitment." For the time being, I wasn't going to argue with him about that. "Are you going to be able to do it? Right on demand like that?" Nathan shut his eyes, and his chest heaved in a quick, scared breath. But he only shrugged again. "I'm doing the best I can." "Coming up with some good tunes, are you?" I asked encouragingly, just to keep him talking. He looked sideways at the floor for a few seconds. "It's hard." "Well, sure it is." "I've thrown away some things already because he didn't like 'em. I'm having trouble coming up with the kind of stuff he wants." I nodded sympathetically, trying to hide the fury I felt. "He says my songs are too introspective." "He's known that since the beginning of the summer," I snapped. "If that wasn't what he wanted, why'd he sign you up?" Nathan just looked at his hands, turning them over as if they were strange to him. He swallowed a couple of times. "I'm starting to feel kind of funny," he said. "Like I'm really losing it. There's music in my head all the time, like always. But when I try to get it down, it all just sounds flat and stupid." My heart wrenched, but I didn't dare speak. "And I can't think of lyrics anymore. I get stuck on the same few words over and over, and they won't rhyme." The mantra started up in my brain again. "Please, God, please." "And now there's all this rain," Nathan said, and bent his head over to rest on his arm, which lay across the curved part of his guitar. His guitar, I noticed, not the Ovation. Taking a cautious glance toward the staircase to make sure Egan wasn't coming, I said rapidly, "Nathan, that evil thing trying to stop you, it wants you to be like this. It wants you to give up and think your music's shutting down. So you have to fight it, okay?" He didn't move. "You have to pray, whether you think anything's there or not, you hear me? And you just have to—" For all I knew, he wasn't even conscious at this point. "Let the flow keep coming," I said helplessly, "because if you think it stops, then it does stop, and then—" Suddenly Egan stood behind the couch, smiling down at us both. "That's right, Nathan," he said. "Listen to your buddy here." At the sound of Egan's voice, Nathan lifted his head, his face brightening into something almost like hope. Egan's hands went to Nathan's shoulders, rubbing them the way Paige and I had on this very couch a few weeks ago. I wondered if Egan's rubbing had the same purpose, to put life and energy back into Nathan. "Yeah, you listen to Tim," Egan went on as he massaged. "He knows, don't you, Tim? Gotta have faith, brother." Nathan didn't seem to notice the mocking tone, probably because he couldn't see Egan's face like I could. He seemed to be relaxing under Egan's hands, his face calming, eyes blanking. "You just have faith and keep the music flowing," Egan told him in a sort of soothing drone, and then his hands went to Nathan's head, stroking his hair, I swear it, and Nathan was actually letting him. It wasn't a sexual thing, it was pure control. Egan was showing me how completely dependent on him Nathan had become. He kept smiling at me over Nate's head, and his eyes fastened on the cross around my neck. "Because nothing means anything if you don't really believe," he said. "Isn't that right, Tim?" I felt as if he knew just exactly how tenuous my grip was on anything resembling real faith in a higher being. My gaze dropped, and I knew I'd lost this round. Nathan's eyes were completely closed. I stood up. "Nathan, I'll see you around. Hang in there, okay?" He might have said, in response, but if he did, that was all he said. "I'll be back to see you in a day or two," I told him, mostly for Egan's benefit, to show him I wasn't through yet. "You do that," Egan said, still grinning, and his hands cupped Nathan's face, oh, so gently. Without another word, I turned and went down the stairs, straight through the bar and outside into the torrents of rain. A fresh bout of thunderstorms moved through in the middle of the night. The thunder was loud enough to wake the dead, but not, apparently, the 3 sleeping Whitleys. I hadn't been asleep. I'd lain awake for hours up in Nathan's room, trying to decide what to do. Somewhere I'd heard the saying that a sour old person is the work of the devil. I could not bear the idea that Nate would turn into that kind of old person, like the thing I'd seen in the car this afternoon. And Egan was building up to that, waiting for the point where he could say, "You've disappointed me, man. You're not the singer and performer I thought you were, and now you're not the songwriter I thought you were either. You just don't have what it takes." Then he'd throw Nathan out. "Please, God, don't let that happen to him," I prayed. "Please." But Egan had almost total control. Nathan wanted nothing more right now than to make Egan happy. And that would be Nathan's downfall. He had Egan and God confused, sure enough. Unless I got him out of there, he'd never be able to see straight again. At last I dragged my duffel bag out of the closet and packed some clothes for me and Nathan, as much as I could stuff in. I pulled my guitar out from under my bed. I wished Nathan's guitar was here. He'd have to leave it at Egan's, maybe, depending on how I got him out of there. So far, I hadn't come up with any definite plan of action. But remembering Egan's hands on Nathan, and Nathan's quiet, almost pleased acceptance of it, I felt as though I could have dragged him away with one arm and fended off Egan with the other. Quietly, I carried the bag and the guitar downstairs and out the back door, and loaded them into the back of the station wagon, getting drenched in the process. Tomorrow I would fill up the tank and sneak soft drinks and food into the car. Then Nathan and I wouldn't have to stop until we were a state or 2 away, and maybe by then he'd be in his right mind again and not run away from me and hitchhike back to Egan or something. Maybe we'd even head back to California. The only thing I couldn't figure out was how to get Nathan into the car in the first place. Upstairs again, I dried off and got into bed, where I lay considering and rejecting plans, trying to decide on one that Egan couldn't get in the way of. Finally, I fell asleep in the middle of fear and indecision. The rain next day made my decision for me, or at least kept me from having to make one. It continued to pour, flash flood warnings were out, and behind us Green River kept rising. In spite of the deluge, I took the station wagon to fill it up and had the oil changed. I bought food, chips and Cokes and junk, but apples too, and stowed them on the floor behind the front seat. At least in the rain, nobody else in the family would stop to peer through the streaming car windows and see the stash of food and my packed duffel bag. I'd planned to go back to River House that night, Friday. But Friday afternoon, Brother Whitley came back from making hospital calls and said, "Highway 26 south of here's washed out, just past the city limit sign where it dips. I tried to go that way to visit the Logans and couldn't get through. Water's all the way across the road." He kept talking about this as he dried off on the back porch, saying the river was already to the top of its banks in most places. "Jack Ogle told me it's been known to flood that field back there and come all the way up to the edge of the parking lot." I tried to imagine that, the backfield a lake, the trees by the river sticking out of it. Mrs. Whitley, as usual, thought immediately of Nathan. "Bob, will Nathan be safe down there? The river's closer up behind that house, isn't it? And it's kind of a rickety frame house anyway." "They'll be fine, Elaine. Surely they'll have sense enough to get out if the water comes up that high. Of course, they still wouldn't be able to come back up this way because of the road." Even Artis looked daunted. Mrs. Whitley started lamenting again about not having any way to call Nathan. "What if something happened to one of us? How could we even let him know, now that the road's impassable?" And her comment gave me the idea, finally, although it took a while to take hold. I can only plead my own anxiety, and the fatigue resulting from it, to explain why I wasn't thinking very clearly. At first I only thought, well, can't go tonight, and not until 10 o'clock did it occur to me to get a map and find an alternate route. Maybe I could detour around and come up on that same road from the south. Downstairs in the hall there was a bookcase through which I'd browsed several times, and on which I remembered seeing a few maps. Tonight, when I checked, I found a road map of Tennessee. All I'd have to do, I discovered, was get out to I-65 and go south, then cut over to Highway 26 at Granbury and come back up north toward River House, as long as some other stretch of road hadn't also been flooded. But it was too late to do anything tonight. Maybe by the next night the rain would have stopped. I wanted to go at night when the bar was open because I wanted to be able to get in, and because I wanted other people there, even if it was only Van and a couple of customers. Maybe then Egan wouldn't fuck with me so much. So I went back upstairs one more time to Nathan's room, knowing that if my plan worked, this would be the last time I'd ever sleep there. I thought of my first night in Berry Springs, how I'd looked forward to an enjoyable summer with my buddy Nate, who had been so normal and happy compared to the wreck he'd turned into. And I prayed again for it all to work out the way it was supposed to. Blue jays alone on a telephone wire outside, braving the rain while the thunder and lightning subside. Wings touch the ground, grounded by birth, watching the elements sink in the dust of the earth. Blue jay surrenders, releases the wire, and flies away from the men with the flat metal coins in their eyes. Circles the air, dangerously high, choked in the altitude, search for that hole in the sky. Where everything's scarlet and white, the prowlers can wait for the night. But how can you stay there with nothing and nowhere and patiently wait there and pray there's a hole in the sky? Blue jay is grazing the rays of ethereal light into the vision of some indescribable sight. Break through the clouds, bathed in the light. Blue jay is born again straight through that hole in the sky. Where everything's scarlet and white, the prowlers can wait for the night. But how can you stay there with nothing and nowhere and patiently wait there and pray there's a hole in the sky? I remember this song well. It's an early song, one of the first Nathan ever played for me when we started hanging out together at college. I can still see him, sitting on the bed in my dorm room, his face serene, his voice tranquil. More than any of the others, this song conjures his essence, the quiet wanting and waiting that I never understood at the time. Now his voice is closer to a cry than I ever heard it get, and still it is a subdued cry, with a tremble in it, held earthbound by the stark, mountainy picking on the guitar. I don't know if any of the hope expressed in the lyrics was left in him by the time he recorded this. I just don't know.